A religious vision, a national stomachache, a 30-year war between two brothers, and a doctor who believed the fate of civilization depended on making breakfast as boring as possible. Those are not the ingredients listed on the side of a cereal box, but they are the recipe. Breakfast cereal is a global industry worth more than $40 billion a year. In the United States, it fills an entire supermarket aisle with color and cartoon mascots. In Ireland, the most devoted cereal country on Earth, the average person eats roughly 8 kilograms of it every year, which works out to about a bowl every single morning. It is one of the most ordinary foods in existence. Pour, splash, eat, forget. And almost nobody eating it knows that it was invented, more or less by accident, inside a religious health resort in Michigan, by a doctor who, by every available account, never consummated his own marriage, who considered flavor itself a moral hazard, and who taught, in print, that a plain and unstimulating diet would help suppress the most dangerous appetite of all. The most famous breakfast in the world came out of a war on human desire. What nobody knew when, the story goes, a batch of boiled wheat was left standing too long in a hospital kitchen in 1894, was that it would become the seed of an empire. An empire that would turn brothers into enemies, drag a small Michigan town into a gold rush, teach the modern world how advertising works, pour sugar into the mouths of 3 generations of children, and end up, more than a century later, owned, of all people, by the makers of Nutella. But the story of breakfast cereal does not start with a flake of corn. It does not even start in Michigan. It starts nearly a century earlier, with a young country that was eating itself sick. The United States, the early 1800s. The first thing on the American breakfast table was not food, it was whiskey. In the early 1800s, Americans took a dram of spirits before a single bite of food, on the theory that it warded off sickness carried in the morning fog. It even had a name, the anti-phogmatic, and workers stopped again for a scheduled communal whiskey break at 11 in the morning. In 1830, American drinking peaked at roughly 7 gallons of pure alcohol per adult per year, the highest level ever recorded in this country, and about 3 times the modern rate. That works out to more than a bottle and a half of liquor a week for every adult in the nation, counting the abstainers. And whiskey was the economical choice. By the 1820s, it sold for 25 cents a gallon, cheaper per drink than beer, wine, coffee, tea, or milk, and often safer than the water. Farm families kept cider besides, by some estimates, 15 gallons per person per year, with a barrel by the front door for anyone to dip into at any hour. According to family legend, John Adams drank a large tankard of hard cider before breakfast every day of his life. His own diary records a humbler ritual, a gill, about 4 ounces, swallowed because he believed it dissolved the phlegm or the bile in his stomach. The legend and the diary disagree on the dose. They agree that a man about to be president of the United States started his day with alcohol and called it medicine. Then came the food: pork for breakfast, pork at noon dinner, pork again at supper. In the South, roughly 150 pounds of pig per person per year, close to half a pound every single day. In 1860, Dr. John S. Wilson, a physician in Columbus, Georgia, wrote that the United States might properly be called the Great Hog-Eating Confederacy, or the Republic of Porkdom. He published that in a ladies' magazine. A full New England tavern breakfast in 1832 meant ham, beef, sausages, pork, bread, butter, boiled potatoes, pies, coffee, and cider. Pie at breakfast was normal. Whole grain porridge took hours to cook down, so the practical American morning was potatoes fried in the congealed grease left from the night before. Charles Dickens, the most famous writer alive, toured the country in 1842 and filed his verdict on its tables: piles of indigestible matter. The country paid in its guts. In hospital ledgers from Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, dyspepsia, the era's catch-all for indigestion, heartburn, and stomach pain, rises from almost nothing at the end of the 1700s into a leading diagnosis and stays there for a century. The press called it the national disease. An 1871 journal called it a national disease and a national sin. A phrase attributed to Walt Whitman called it the Great American Stomachache. It was the obesity debate of its day, and the panic built a market. One 1879 advertisement claimed more than 30,000 dyspeptics cured by something called health foods. A nation was clutching its stomach, waiting for someone to blame. The men who stepped forward were not doctors. They were preachers, and they had decided that the sin was the food itself. Into this nation of aching stomachs walked Sylvester Graham, a Presbyterian minister from West Suffield, Connecticut, who started as a temperance lecturer and concluded alcohol was one head of a larger beast. The beast was stimulation. Meat stimulated, spice stimulated, coffee and tea stimulated. Rich food inflamed the body, and an inflamed body burned with lust. His cure was total blandness, coarse whole wheat bread, vegetables, water, 2 meals a day, no condiments, not even black pepper, cold baths, hard mattresses, open windows. He condemned featherbeds as sexually stimulating. In 1832, cholera swept the country, and Graham announced the plague came from overstimulated stomachs and debauched living. It was terrible medicine and magnificent marketing, because in a cholera year, the man who says the plague comes from your dinner table will pack halls in New York and Philadelphia. The crowds got more than diet advice. His lecture to young men on chastity ran 206 pages and returned to masturbation 33 times while using the word exactly once. He reportedly advised married couples to ration themselves to 12 times a year, once a month, for the healthy. In 1837, he published a treatise on bread, accusing commercial bakers of bulking white flour with chalk, alum, and clay, and insisting true bread be baked at home from Graham flour by the mother of the family. The bakers took this personally, so did the butchers. His lectures reportedly sparked riots in Providence and Portland, Maine, and according to the story told for decades, when Boston's butchers and bakers marched on the hotel where he spoke in 1837, his followers shoveled quicklime from the roof until the crowd scattered. The apostle of blandness was saved by chemical warfare. That same year, the movement built institutions, a physiological society Graham himself helped found, and a health journal. And across the Northeast, Grahamite boarding houses, at least 6, reportedly promised straw mattresses, cold showers, and bans on gravy, pastry, melted butter, and raw cucumbers. Eggs, mercifully, were permitted. The boarding houses Graham had almost nothing to do with. In 1840, Oberlin College put its dining hall on the diet. A professor who brought a pepper shaker to table was forced to remove it and soon lost his job, a connection the professor himself alleged. By March 1841, the students revolted, declaring the regimen inadequate to the demands of the human system. Oberlin surrendered. Emerson, in a line attributed to his journals, called him the poet of bran bread and pumpkins. The mockery outlived the man. In September 1851, dying at 57, Graham reportedly let his physician prescribe meat, liquor, and opium, breaking every rule he had preached, and regretting it, one visitor said, to the end. He never earned a cent from the Graham cracker. The commercial version appeared some 30 years after his death, and Nabisco's 1898 cracker was sweetened with sugar, the indulgence he had crusaded against. His name survives today on a cookie he would have condemned as sin. But the doctrine did not die with the doctor. In Portland, Maine, a city where mobs had come for him, a sickly teenage girl had begun seeing visions, and her believers would turn blandness from a lecture into a religion. Portland, Maine, December 1844. 2 months earlier, on October 22nd, thousands of Americans called Millerites had, according to the stories told afterward, given away farms, closed shops, and climbed hills to wait for Jesus Christ to return on schedule. He did not. History remembers the morning after as the Great Disappointment, and most of the disappointed drifted quietly back to their lives. One of them did not. Ellen Gould Harmon was 17, a frail Milltown girl who at around the age of 9 had taken a thrown stone to the face, lain senseless for 3 weeks, and never finished school. That December, praying with 4 other women in a Portland house, she felt herself rising, in her own words, higher and higher, far above the dark world. It was the first of what her church would eventually count as some 2,000 visions. Witnesses swore that in vision she did not breathe, sometimes for hours, and that strong men could not move her. Every one of those witnesses was a believer, and skeptics have pointed to the childhood head wound ever since. The record allows both readings. The believers did not need both. In 1855, Ellen and her husband James hauled their small printing press to Battle Creek, Michigan, a mill town of no particular importance. And on May 21, 1863, the Seventh-day Adventist Church formally organized there, roughly 3,500 members, about one mid-sized high school's worth of people. 16 days later, at a farmhouse prayer meeting near Otsego, Ellen White froze in vision for 45 minutes. She woke carrying a divine health code: fresh air, sunshine, exercise, pure water, temperance in all things, with meat, tobacco, tea, and coffee condemned. You could print that list in a wellness newsletter today and nobody would blink, but the ideas were not new. Adventists had been reading Sylvester Graham and his fellow reformers for years, and even church historians concede the vision matched what was already on their shelves. The vision did not invent the doctrine, it promoted it. Graham had preached brand to hostile crowds. Ellen White delivered it as the Word of God. Her very first health publication, an 1864 pamphlet called An Appeal to Mothers, devoted itself almost entirely to the ruin caused by the solitary vice. The health message and the war on sex arrived together, stapled into the same doctrine. Remember the title of this episode. On Christmas Day, 1865, a second vision instructed the church to build a health institution of its own. The members obeyed. A congregation of 3,500 reportedly raised roughly $11,000, about 20 years of a laborer's wages, and on September 5, 1866, the Western Health Reform Institute opened in a 28-room house bought from a state Supreme Court justice. Opening day staff, 5. Opening day patients, 1. Within a month, there were 12. A town chosen by a printing press now had an institution commanded by a vision, a doctrine, and a diet with no food in it. Because in Dansville, New York, a doctor had reportedly already invented one. In 1858, on a hillside above Dansville, New York, sat a failed water cure resort that had already bankrupted 3 owners, and the man who took it over was James Caleb Jackson, a former abolitionist newspaperman who turned to medicine after cold water, he believed, had saved his own collapsing body in 1846. He renamed the place Our Home on the Hillside, and he ran it on a doctrine of subtraction: no meat, no white flour, no alcohol, tobacco, tea, or coffee, no drugs of any kind. Jackson held that medicines were not only unnecessary, but absolutely injurious. He prescribed water, whole grains, hillside walks, and 2 meals a day, and some 20,000 patients climbed that hill to take the prescription. And in 1863, According to the story told for decades afterward, Jackson walked into that kitchen and invented an industry. The recipe was Graham flour and water, nothing else. No sugar, no salt, no concessions. The dough was rolled into sheets, baked into brittle slabs, broken apart, baked a second time, and ground into nuggets. Jackson called it Granola, and it is generally credited as the first manufactured cold breakfast cereal on Earth. It was very nearly inedible. The nuggets were too hard to chew dry. By the house's own telling, they had to soak in milk for 20 minutes at minimum, and preferably overnight. This was a breakfast you started the night before. Patients reportedly gave it their own name, Wheat Rocks. Jackson reportedly sold the rocks for 20 cents a pound, roughly 10 times the price of ordinary flour, more than an hour of a laborer's wages for baked flour. People paid it. At its peak, the local histories say the hillside kitchen turned out £60,000 a year and struggled to keep up. But the legend has a paperwork problem. Jackson did not trademark the name Granola until 1876, 13 years after the supposed invention, and one modern investigation could find no printed trace of the word before that year, while his wife, Lucretia Jackson, published essentially the entire recipe in her 1867 cookbook under the humble name Rusk. The first cold cereal in history may have been invented by a woman whose name never went on the package, and the name that did go on the package would be fought over too, one letter at a time. That fight waits at the very end of this story, and every bag of granola on a grocery shelf today is a relic of it. Meanwhile, the idea was already traveling. In August 1864, Ellen White arrived at our home for 3 weeks and watched everything: the diet, the baths, the 2 spare meals. She returned in 1865 after her husband's stroke and left unhappy, writing that the sophistry of the devil prevailed in Dansville. But after that first visit, she had already written, "I do think we should have an institution in Michigan." In September 1866, Battle Creek got one, the institute whose one patient opening day we just watched. It was small, it was struggling, and it was waiting. Because in 1876, the church would hand its keys to an ambitious young doctor named John Harvey Kellogg, and nothing about breakfast would ever be small again. In July 1876, the board of the failing Western Health Reform Institute handed everything to John Harvey Kellogg, a 24-year-old with a new Bellevue medical degree, whose tuition the church's own leader, James White, had partly lent him. The board's terms were blunt: take the job, or the institute closes. He took it. Within a year, he had renamed the place the Battle Creek Sanitarium, built around a word he essentially invented, sanitarium, which he defined as a place where people learn to stay well. The world came to call it the San. And under the boy doctor, a failing Adventist water cure turned into the most famous medical resort on earth. By the institution's own count, patient volume grew from 106 in 1866 to 7,006 in 1906, and the lifetime total passed 400,000 guests. At its height, the San sprawled across more than 30 buildings on 30 acres, slept nearly 1,300 guests, and employed, in Kellogg's own words, never less than 800. It was a small city with a single organizing principle: the American bowel. Guests were hosed, wrapped, and plunged in every configuration of water the hydrotherapy wards could devise. They sat in electric light baths, cabinets lined with glowing bulbs, reportedly prescribed for diabetes, insomnia, and writer's cramp. They rode a vibrating chair that shook them up to 60 times per second, a treatment for constipation. They took exercise classes to the sound of live marching bands. A sign in the dining room ordered them to chew each bite roughly 40 times, and the doctor led a chewing song. And there were the enemas. The machines could pump 15 quarts of water per minute into a human being, and the signature treatment was a pint of yogurt, half eaten at the table, half administered from the other direction. In 1914, room and board started at $14 a week, with every treatment billed on top. The famous came anyway. William Howard Taft registered as guest number 100,000. Henry Ford came, and Thomas Edison, and Amelia Earhart, and Sojourner Truth, and, in 1929, an 80-year-old Ivan Pavlov. Kellogg collected them deliberately as walking advertisements. A doctor who by many accounts dressed entirely in white cycled the grounds dictating to a secretary, reportedly with a white cockatoo on his shoulder. The vibrating chair and one of the white suits sit in a Battle Creek museum today. Then, before dawn on February 18, 1902, fire broke out in a lower-level bathroom and took the entire main building in about 2 hours. All 407 occupants escaped. The single death, reportedly, was an elderly man who ran back inside for his life savings. The loss neared $500,000, mostly uninsured. Kellogg got the news in Chicago and, according to the story, spent the 2-hour train ride home sketching a bigger building. 15 months later, it reopened. 6 stories, a glass-domed palm garden, a waterfall, a cost above $1 million. The sand did not shrink from disaster. It doubled. Every tray in that palace carried the same food: grains, yogurt, no meat, no spice, nothing that could excite anyone. Because to understand why the food tasted like nothing, you have to understand what the doctor believed it was for. In 1877, at 25, John Harvey Kellogg published a book called Plain Facts About Sexual Life, later expanded and retitled Plain Facts for Old and Young. According to the Adventist Encyclopedia, he wrote the 356-page first edition in 14 days. It reportedly sold more than 500,000 copies, door to door, by subscription, roughly 1 copy for every 100 Americans alive in 1880. And in its pages, the smiling doctor of the Battle Creek Sanitarium laid out a war plan against human desire. In the expanded 644-page edition, 97 pages, about 1 page in 7, are devoted to what Kellogg called the solitary vice. He gave parents 39 warning signs of a guilty child: round shoulders, acne, bedwetting, biting the fingernails, a love of solitude, bashfulness, also unnatural boldness. The list was a trap with no exit. Read honestly, almost every child on earth qualifies. Sign number 27 deserves special attention. Sign number 27 is a disgust for simple food. A child who, in Kellogg's words, seems to loathe any food which is not rendered hot and stimulating with spices and other condiments, was exhibiting evidence of the vice. Rejecting bland food was not a matter of taste, it was a symptom, because in Kellogg's medicine, food and lust were the same fire. Meat inflamed it, spices fed it. Candies, spices, cinnamon, cloves, peppermint, and all strong essences, he wrote, powerfully excite the genital organs. He claimed a cool, unstimulating diet would delay the development of the sexual organism, in his own words, for several months, and perhaps for a year or 2. And one sentence reads today like the mission statement of his entire food empire. It may with truth be said, the sentence goes, that the devices of modern cookery are most powerful allies of unchastity and licentiousness. On February 22, 1879, Kellogg married Ella Eaton. They kept separate bedrooms for 41 years, had no biological children, and by every available account, the marriage was never consummated. He reportedly spent much of their 6-week honeymoon revising Plain Facts. Not writing it, the book had been in print for 2 years. He revised his warnings about sex. On his honeymoon, his prescriptions for children caught in the vice were harsher than his diet, and this is where the comedy drains out of the story. For boys, he recommended surgery without anesthetic, writing that the brief pain would have a salutary effect upon the mind, especially if it be connected with the idea of punishment. For girls, his recommendations were worse. Most of the medical establishment, to its credit, quietly ignored that part. So it needs saying plainly. Cornflakes were not invented as an anti-masturbation device. The patent, filed the very next year, would describe only an easily digested food for invalids. But the flake was born inside this doctrine. Engineered for the bland, passion-quieting diet its inventor spent his life promoting. Two true facts, fused by the internet into one false origin story. In 2019, it was reportedly the most Googled question in South Africa. The doctor wanted a food that would quiet the human body. In 1894, in the sanitarium's kitchen, that search was about to produce the most profitable accident in the history of breakfast. In 1894, in a kitchen at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, a batch of boiled wheat was left standing too long. That is the story. According to the legend, the company polished for decades, the Kellogg's were called away, and the wheat sat. Hours, says one account. Overnight, says another. 2 days, says a third. The batch came back stale, and the frugal younger brother refused to waste it, so the spoiled wheat went through the rollers anyway. And instead of a smeared sheet of dough, each softened wheat berry flattened into a single thin flake, and when the flakes were baked, they came out crisp. The modern breakfast fell out of a rolling machine by mistake. The records suggest something less tidy. The brothers contradicted each other about that day for the rest of their lives. John Harvey insisted the idea came to him in a dream. Will said it was simple thrift. Some family accounts credit Ella Eaton Kellogg, the doctor's wife, who ran the sanitarium's experimental kitchen and wrote its cookbook, with suggesting the rolling in the first place, and even the year is disputed. But the chemistry underneath the legend is real. The accidental delay let moisture spread evenly through each wheat berry, a step the industry now performs on purpose and calls tempering. Modern flake plants deliberately stale their grain for about 24 hours before rolling it. Every flake made today begins with that mistake, reenacted on schedule. In 1895, the flakes went on sale as Granola baked on improvised machinery in a barn on the sanitarium grounds, seasoned with salt rather than sugar, and mailed to former patients, because the doctor forbade selling his invalid food to the merely healthy. A bread substitute for ruined stomachs, from a kitchen built to feed no appetites. The first year reportedly moved more than 100,000 pounds, and the arithmetic was indecent. A bushel of wheat cost 60 cents. Baked into 10-ounce boxes at 15 cents apiece, that bushel grossed $12, a 20-to-1 markup on plain grain, in full view of every ambitious man in town. On May 31, 1895, John Harvey Kellogg filed the patent, flaked cereals and process of preparing same, granted in April 1896. And it carried exactly one name, the other, Kellogg, Will Keith, the silent bookkeeper brother who ran the ovens and the accounts, reportedly for $3 a day or less, and would do so for nearly 25 years in all, appears nowhere on it. He wrote in his diary, "I'm afraid I will always be a poor man." But he could read a ledger, and the ledger said the accident was worth more than the sanitarium. In 1898, the brothers tried the same trick on corn. The first cornflakes went rancid soon after purchase, and getting them right would take thousands of attempts. Will kept the books, Will kept quiet. Will waited. And Will was not the only one watching, because in 1891, 3 years before the stale batch, the Battle Creek legend says a broken and penniless patient rolled through the front doors in a wheelchair. Remember him? Battle Creek, Michigan, February 1891. Charles William Post was pushed through the front doors of the sanitarium in a wheelchair. He was 36 years old, broke and wrecked, nervous prostration, chronic dyspepsia, a body that had simply stopped cooperating. He was a restless businessman out of Springfield, Illinois, and this was not his first ruin. He had broken down once in the farm implement business. He had broken down again chasing real estate in Fort Worth. Now, on a day the sources still dispute, he was delivered to Dr. John Harvey Kellogg to be saved. He stayed 9 months, and here the story turned on a detail almost too good to be true. Reportedly, Post could not pay his bill and worked it off in the sanitarium kitchen, the same kitchen where Kellogg's experimental foods were made. The caramel coffee substitute, the granola, the recipes Kellogg reportedly refused, on principle, to patent because health was his gift to humanity. So, for 9 months, according to this account, the doctor's future rival stood at the doctor's own stove, taking notes with his hands. It did not cure him. On November 9th, 1891, Post left, still sick, after Kellogg reportedly told Post's wife, who was also, confusingly, named Ella, that the case was untreatable and nothing more could be done. Ella Post did not accept that. She brought in a Christian Science practitioner, commonly named as Elizabeth Gregory, and under her care, healing by mental suggestion, the man medicine had abandoned got better almost immediately. Post drew the obvious conclusion, and drew it at full volume. By March 1892, he had opened his own rival resort right there in Battle Creek, La Vita Inn, a mind cure house that served meat, which in 1890's Battle Creek amounted to open heresy. In 1894, he published a book titled, With Characteristic Restraint, I Am Well. None of it made real money. Then, in January 1895, in a small white barn, Post roasted wheat bran and molasses into a coffee substitute he called Postum, a product bearing a remarkable resemblance to the caramel coffee from Kellogg's own kitchen. Postum lost $800 in its first year, gambled on burnt wheat. By the end of 1896, it was selling $3,000 worth a month, and Post incorporated with $50,000 of capital. In 1897 came Grape Nuts, a hard-baked cereal containing neither grapes nor nuts, though some accounts say the first boxes did not sell until the following January. Remember where this chapter began. The Kelloggs had invented the flake, the greatest breakfast idea of the century, and were sitting on it. Post sat on nothing, because the thing C.W. Post could manufacture better than any man alive was not food, and it was not health. It was wanting, and he was about to sell it to the entire country. Post did not sell cereal. He sold fear, and he largely wrote it himself. Grape Nuts, his flagship, went to market under slogans that read today like a prosecutor's exhibit. Makes red blood. Brains are built by grape nuts. The ads claimed the cereal was pre-digested. They claimed it could tighten loose teeth. They claimed it helped against malaria, against consumption, against appendicitis. Inside every box came a booklet titled The Road to Wellville, a phrase that would outlive its author by 8 decades. His Postum campaigns invented entire diseases: coffee heart, coffee neuralgia, brain fag. His testimonials quoted doctors who did not exist. By the early 1900s, Post was spending more than $1 million a year on advertising, roughly 2,000 workers' annual wages, and ranked among the top 5 advertisers in America. 11 years after arriving in Battle Creek a broken invalid, he was a millionaire. In 1904, the machine misfired. Post launched his cornflakes as Elijah's manna, with the prophet and a raven on the box. Clergy denounced it from pulpits as sacrilege, and Britain refused to register the trademark. Post sneered in print that perhaps no one should eat angel food cake or work for Bethlehem Steel. Then he blinked. The product became Post Toasties in 1908, and by then, Kellogg's had taken the cornflake lead. The reckoning came over one word: appendicitis. Grape Nuts ads claimed the cereal could obviate the necessity of an operation. The publisher of Collier's Weekly called that potentially deadly lying. Post answered with a smear campaign costing roughly $150,000, 300 years of a worker's wages, accusing the magazine of extortion under the headline, "The Yellow Man and One of His Ways." Collier's sued for libel. At trial in 1910, cross-examination pulled the machine apart in public. The unsolicited testimonials were solicited, paid for, never checked for truth, and rewritten before publication. The jury awarded Collier's $50,000, an unprecedented libel sum, about a century of an ordinary salary. The verdict was reversed on appeal in 1912, and the new trial apparently never happened, so Post never paid. But the cure claims quietly vanished from his advertising. In early March 1914, gravely ill, Post chartered a non-stop private train from Santa Barbara to the Mayo Clinic, $5,000 for the ride, where the Mayo brothers operated on him for suspected appendicitis. It was the disease his serial had promised to make unnecessary. The surgery was pronounced a success, but the pain stayed, and by some accounts, he came to fear it was cancer. On May 9, 1914, at his Santa Barbara home, Charles William Post died of a self-inflicted rifle shot. He was 59. His fortune, most commonly put at $20 million, passed whole to his only child, Marjorie Merriweather Post, a 27-year-old who would build it into General Foods, and grape nuts is still on shelves today. By the company's own boast, the same product it was 125 years ago. Battle Creek had been watching all of it, and the town had not waited for the ending. The lesson had landed a decade before the rifle. By 1902, a bankrupt invalid had roasted bran in a barn and made himself a millionaire. If he could do that, anyone could. The town was about to show how many believed it. Battle Creek, Michigan, 1902. A dozen years before that morning in Santa Barbara, C.W. Post was very much alive, already a millionaire, and he had just shown the country what a bag of grain and a printing press could do. The country came to collect. The arithmetic that drew them was the arithmetic from the sanitarium barn, 60 cents in, $12 out, and the story goes, it passed from mouth to mouth like scripture. $12 was about 2 weeks of a workman's wages, from 1 bushel. Men have started wars over worse math, so they came. And here, the numbers turned slippery, because the counters themselves could not keep up. More than 40 cereal companies were operating in Battle Creek at the same moment in 1902, 42 launched in the boom by W.K. Kellogg's own count, and across the whole decade, by the most patient tally, 101 separate cereal manufacturers existed at some stage of life. This was a town of roughly 18,500 people. That is 1 cereal company for every 500 residents. According to the story, hired touts called cappers met the trains at the Michigan Central Depot, signing strangers up for factory stock before they were off the platform, across from a billboard that reportedly read, "Better yourself in Battle Creek." Whole families sank life savings into nothing more than a trade name, a recipe, and second-hand machinery. Production began wherever a roof could be borrowed. Factories ran in sheds. Factories ran in shacks. Factories ran in tents, with hammering reportedly heard through the night as newcomers threw up shelter. The shelves filled accordingly. Corn Crisp, Malta Vita, Cerro Fruto, a wheat flake sprayed with apple jelly, Triabeta, advertised as peptonized and celery impregnated, Orange Meat, which contained no orange, My Food, Luck Boy. At the height of it, the story goes, a Methodist preacher named D.D. Martin, a man of God with a cereal recipe, sold his formula for per foe for $100,000, paid entirely in company stock. That distinction was about to matter enormously, because almost none of it was real. Reportedly, Frumenta's flakes were so brittle their edges cut customers' mouths. Norca's oats went grey on the shelf, and one promoter claimed his cereal could raise the dead. And with no food law and no securities regulation, nobody was obliged to stop him. In 1905 and 1906, 18 Battle Creek cereal companies were formally dissolved. By 1910, nearly all of them were gone. The tents emptied as fast as they had risen. The preacher's $100,000 in stock, in all likelihood worth roughly the paper it was printed on. Of the entire stampede, the survivors numbered, in essence, two: Kellogg's and Post. Those two companies anchored Battle Creek for the next century, a town built on the 100-odd that did not make it. And through all of it, one man had watched the frenzy from inside the sanitarium. He was the quiet bookkeeper, the brother who swore to the end of his life that the flake was his, still reportedly drawing $3 a day. In 1906, he decided he was finished waiting. On February 19, 1906, Will Keith Kellogg incorporated the Battle Creek Toasted Corn Flake Company. The financing came through Charles D. Bolin, a St. Louis insurance man and former sanitarium patient. And here is the detail the cereal boxes never mention. At the founding, the majority stockholder was not Will. It was his brother. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg blessed the venture in exchange for a large block of stock. It did not stay that way. The doctor, a famously frugal employer, handed shares to his sanitarium physicians partly in place of pay, and Will reportedly bought them up, quietly, much of it while his brother was traveling abroad, until the controlling interest sat in the younger Kellogg's pocket. Then Will committed heresy. He added sugar to the flakes, with malt and salt, over his brother's bitter objections. John had spent decades preaching that flavor was the road to ruin. Will decided flavor was the road to every grocery shelf in America. The flake stopped being medicine. It became food. And then he bet the company on a magazine page. Will put more than a third of the firm's entire working capital, every third dollar the company possessed, into one full-page advertisement in the Ladies' Home Journal, the biggest women's magazine in the country. According to the company's own founding legend, the ad opened by confessing that it violated all the rules of good advertising because most grocers did not yet stock the product. It told housewives to demand it. Sales climbed toward 3,000 cases a day. The legend is polished. The bet was real. In the summer of 1907, he told the women of New York that Wednesday was Wink Day. Wink at your grocer on Wednesday and a free box of cornflakes was yours. Wink on Tuesday and you were turned away. City sales rose roughly 15-fold, from about 2 railroad cars of cereal a month to more than 30. That same year, his company began giving families funny Jungleland moving pictures, free with every 2 boxes. A booklet of mix-and-match cartoon animals, widely called the first cereal premium. 2.5 million copies in circulation by 1912. But the sharpest weapon was the smallest. The town's 40-odd imitators were still hammering in their tents, so Will printed a facsimile of his own handwriting on every package, beside a warning. Beware of imitations, none genuine without this signature, W.K. Kellogg. The man who once confided to his diary that he feared he would always be poor, made his own name the mark of trust. That script signature, now printed in red, is the Kellogg's logo on cereal boxes to this day. Meanwhile, at the great sanitarium, the doctor watched his little brother grow rich. Rich on the flake from their kitchen. Rich on the sugar the doctor had preached against. Rich, above all, on a name that belonged to both of them. John Harvey Kellogg had signed away a company. He had not signed away being a Kellogg. The next fight would not be settled in a boardroom. It would be settled in a courtroom, and the prize would be the family name itself. In 1909, Will renamed his firm the Kellogg Toasted Corn Flake Company, and the doctor answered in kind. John Harvey rechristened his own health food outfit the Kellogg Food Company, and began selling Kellogg's sterilized bran so that no shopper could tell the brothers apart. That was the point. The name was now worth a fortune, and each man claimed it as a birthright. In August 1910, Will sued his own brother. John countersued. In February 1911, they signed a peace of sorts, a contract keeping the word Kellogg off any flaked cereal John made or sold. The peace held 5 years. In August 1916, the two collided in the bran market. Will's toasted bran flakes against John's sterilized bran, and this time, the doctor sued first. The peace was over for good. Neither side stopped until the Supreme Court of Michigan made them. At trial, John Harvey's argument was his fame. In 1920, he was arguably the best-known doctor in America, and Kellogg, he insisted, meant him. Will's argument was simpler. His company had spent millions on advertising, and to the ordinary shopper, Kellogg no longer meant a physician. It meant cornflakes. On December 21, 1920, after a month-long trial, the court agreed, affirming the decree of Judge Walter H. North, the trial judge who had first ruled for the younger brother. The court held that Will's company had first established Kellogg as a trade name for food, and that the doctor had failed to carry his burden of proof. The best-known doctor in America lost the right to sell food under his own name, and he paid the litigation's costs for the privilege. He could still print his surname on his own products in inconspicuous ways. In practice, tiny type on the bottom of the box. 10 years of lawsuits, 2 brothers, 1 name. And the fight did not even stop at the water's edge. From 1916 to 1921, the brothers reportedly waged the same war over the name abroad, a campaign that ran longer than the American one, and Will won there too. After 1920, the brothers rarely, if ever, spoke again. The 2 men who had worked the 1894 flaking experiments side by side in a sanitarium kitchen settled into an estrangement of roughly 3 decades, the rest of both their lives. The partnership that had invented an industry ended in silence. The courts had settled which brother owned the name. What the doctor did next with his own would be much harder to live down. This is where the story of breakfast cereal stops being strange and becomes something darker. By the 1910s, John Harvey Kellogg had lost the flakes and was losing the name, but he had already found a new obsession, and he pursued it with the same energy he had once poured into diet and exercise. He called it race betterment. In January 1914, Battle Creek hosted the first national conference on race betterment, built around Kellogg and the foundation he had established there. Hundreds of delegates attended, physicians, professors, public officials. A second conference followed in 1915 in San Francisco, held alongside the Panama Pacific Exposition, and a third returned to Battle Creek in 1928. Their stated purpose was to fight what the organizers called race degeneracy, the belief that the human stock of the nation was deteriorating and could be bred back to health like a herd. Kellogg promoted a national registry of human pedigrees in which families would be catalogued and scored. At the 1915 conference, he announced a eugenics registry, and an office was established in Battle Creek, in cooperation with the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor. He supported the segregation of people judged defective. He lent his name and his fame to the movement pushing sterilization laws through American state houses. Michigan had introduced the nation's first sterilization bill back in 1897, before the idea was fashionable anywhere. By the 1930s, more than 30 American states had such laws, and tens of thousands of Americans were sterilized under them, most without meaningful consent. In 1927, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the practice in an opinion containing one of the most notorious sentences in American legal history. 3 generations of imbeciles, the court declared, are enough. The doctor's part in this was not whispered. His words on race betterment were delivered from conference podiums and printed in published proceedings, not confided to private letters. None of this was fringe. That is the uncomfortable part. Eugenics in those decades was endorsed by universities, funded by great fortunes, and taught from textbooks. A health celebrity lending his shine to it was not a scandal, it was respectable. That is exactly what makes it worth remembering. And here, the doctor's contradictions reach their strangest point. Because while his foundation preached the power of heredity, Kellogg and his wife had spent decades fostering children. 42 of them by the standard count, of many races and backgrounds, several of them legally adopted, raised partly to demonstrate his belief that environment could overcome ancestry. His own household was a standing argument against his own movement. He held both ideas at once. Biographers have been arguing about it ever since. By the time the doctor died in 1943, the ideology he had helped make respectable had been carried to its logical conclusion in Europe, and the world was at war with it. His conferences were forgotten. His registry never grew beyond that one office in Battle Creek. The universal national catalogue of families he envisioned never came to be. His name survived on billions of cereal boxes. While the doctor chased pedigrees, the company that bore his name was mastering a different science altogether. That science was advertising. By 1912, it had bolted 80 tons of iron above Times Square, a sign 106 feet wide, its single letter K taller than a 6-story building, and a mechanical boy who cried the words, "I want Kellogg's," then grinned the words, "I got Kellogg's" at Broadway below. Down on the shelves, the pledge was quieter, a printed copy of W.K. Kellogg's signature, the signature still on every box today. But the machine W.K. built was about to be copied. In 1924, the Minneapolis milling giant Washburn Crosby launched Wheaties, a cereal born when a clinician spilled bran gruel on a hot stove, hardened through more than 3 dozen attempts into a flake that could survive shipping. On Christmas Eve 1926, a barbershop quartet on Minneapolis radio sang a song called "Have You Tried Wheaties?", widely credited as radio's first singing commercial, performed live weekly by an undertaker, a printer, a grain merchant, and a yodeling municipal court bailiff for $15 a week. By 1929, the brand had fallen to 53,000 cases, and the board moved to kill it, until an ad man showed that more than half of all sales came from the one market that could hear the song, because the jingle worked. The campaign went national, and in 1933, an adman named Knox Reeves, reportedly sketching on a pad on the spot, gave a minor league ballpark billboard the words, "Wheaties, the breakfast of champions." In 1934, Lou Gehrig became the first athlete on the box. Meanwhile, the industry learned to bill the children directly. Kellogg had launched Rice Krispies in 1928, a cereal whose accidental genius was noise, advertised in 1929 as so crisp it actually crackles in cream. In 1931, the company began sponsoring The Singing Lady, promoted as America's first network radio program for children, and by 1932, a radio spot on that same show had built the whole campaign around the sound. 3 words. Snap, crackle, pop. Nobody knows who wrote them. Kellogg's has no record. The agency no longer exists. But in 1933, an illustrator named Vernon Grant, who walked into that agency with 3 gnomes he had drawn and named, left with a $5,000 retainer, millions in today's money, and nearly $250,000 by 1941. For 3 gnomes, in July 1933, radio premiered Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, an invented teenager whose every on-air gadget could be ordered for a box top plus a dime, half an hour's work at the first federal minimum wage. Hit items shipped in the millions. Then the Depression sorted the believers from the bookkeepers. According to the standard telling, Kellogg's board voted to cut advertising, and WK, semi-retired in California, came back to Battle Creek and made them vote again, this time adding $1 million to the budget. Profits rose almost 30% by 1933, the bottom of the Depression. Post saved its money. Post pinched its pennies. Post lost the lead and never got it back. The machine could now sell a plain toasted flake through a child's ears, but the sugar was still hiding inside the dough, where WK had stirred it in 1906. No one had yet thought to put the sugar on at the factory, in a shell the child could see. Somebody was about to. Chester, Pennsylvania, 1939. A heater salesman named Jim Rex watched his children bury their puffed wheat under spoonful after spoonful of sugar. According to the story, what he did next was an act of restraint. He worked out a flash baking process that sealed each puff in a thin shell of honey and corn syrup, so a light coating at the factory would stop a heavy one at the table. He called it Ranger Joe Popped Wheat Honeys, the first pre-sweetened cereal ever widely sold. Jim Rex had built a seatbelt. The industry would use it as an accelerator. Rex did not stay to watch. Reportedly, he sold the company in the early 1940s after his son, one of the children who inspired the cereal, was captured at Wake Island in December 1941. In 1949, Post took the idea national with Sugar Crisp and aimed it straight past the parents. The launch campaign is credited as the first animated cereal commercial on television, starring 3 cartoon bears named Dandy, Handy, and Candy, and the jingle told children to eat it like candy. Sugar Crisp reportedly arrived at 51% sugar by weight, which means the cereal was the minority ingredient in the cereal. The copies came fast. Kellogg's launched Corn Pops in 1950 and renamed it Sugar Corn Pops in 1951, because in 1951, sugar was not a confession. It was a selling point. Sugar Frosted Flakes followed in 1952, then Sugar Smacks in 1953, reportedly the sweetest thing yet sold as breakfast. General Mills piled on with Sugar Smiles, Sugar Jets, and Tricks. In 1952, the sugar needed a face. At the Leo Burnett Agency in Chicago, Kellogg's held a mascot audition for Sugar Frosted Flakes. Katie the kangaroo, Elmo the elephant, Newt the gnu, and a tiger named Tony, named after an ad man down the hall. Tony won. Katie shared the box for about a year, then vanished. Thurl Ravenscroft, the bass singer who also recorded the Grinch's theme song, took over the role a year later and growled Tony's catchphrase for 5 decades. The mascots now had somewhere to live. By the 1970s, at least 1 of every 3 commercial minutes on Saturday morning television reportedly sold cereal. A network executive reportedly said, "You might say they invented Saturday morning." The average American child between 6 and 11 watched about 28 hours of television a week, the hours of a part-time job. By the mid-1970s, a cereal called Super Orange Crisp would reportedly test at nearly 71% sugar, nearly 3 spoonfuls of sugar for every spoonful of everything else. Decades later, when the word became a liability, the industry performed quiet vocabulary surgery. Sugar Frosted Flakes became Frosted Flakes. Sugar Corn Pops became Corn Pops. Sugar Smacks became Honey Smacks. The recipe still sweet and the honey a minor ingredient. And in Canada, nobody bothered. Sugar Crisp sits on shelves under its own name today. But the quiet part had been noticed. In the summer of 1970, a private citizen carried a chart into a United States Senate hearing room. On the chart were the industry's own numbers. The industry was about to hear them read aloud. The man doing the counting was Robert Choate, a civil engineer turned hunger activist who had served on Nixon's White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health. On July 23, 1970, he walked into a hearing of the Senate Commerce Committee's Consumer Subcommittee carrying a chart. The chart ranked the 60 best-selling dry cereals in America by nutritional content on a scale that sources from the time put at roughly 700 points. Choate had not run a single laboratory test. He had built the entire ranking from the manufacturer's own published numbers. 40 of the 60 cereals scored below 100, 2/3 of the breakfast aisle. Choate gave them a name that would outlive him: empty calories, foods that, in his words, fatten but do little to prevent malnutrition. Most cereals, he told the senators, were no more nourishing than a candy bar. Then, in case the room had missed the point, he compared them to gin, and the bottom of that chart was not a rogues gallery of obscure brands. It held the flagships: Corn Flakes, Rice Krispies, Cheerios, shredded wheat, Wheaties, the breakfast of champions. Time magazine covered the testimony under a headline that flipped the most famous slogan in breakfast on its head: breakfast of chumps, with a question mark hanging off the end. Newsweek went with Snap, Crackle, Flop. Only 3 cereals out of 60 scored above 700. Kellogg's Product 19, General Mills Total, and a marshmallow children's cereal called Kaboom. Hold on to that last name. The counterattack took 12 days. On August 4, executives from Quaker Oats and General Foods appeared before the same subcommittee with hired science. Harvard nutritionist Frederick Stair, seated beside Quaker's own research director, argued that Choate had ignored the way 95% of cereal is actually eaten, which is with milk. The very next day, another Harvard nutritionist, Gene Mayer, took the same chair and sided against Stair. Kellogg's reportedly went after Choate himself, an engineer presuming to talk nutrition, but no company ever successfully disputed his figures, because the figures were their own. Meanwhile, shoppers had already voted. One Portland grocery buyer reported Product 19 sales jumping 50% in a single week to 130 cases a week, more than Kellogg's could ship. And the industry found its real answer not in the hearing room, but in the factory. Within 2 years, by most accounts, the manufacturers had fortified across the line, spraying vitamins onto the same sugar. That spray was exactly how Kaboom, a candy in cereal's clothing, had cracked the top 3. The chart measured added nutrients, and fortification gamed it perfectly. Choate understood. In 1971, he came back to the Senate with a revised chart that counted the milk and rescored the freshly sprayed boxes. Voluntary nutrition labels reportedly began appearing on cereal packages, feeding into federal labeling rules in 1974. The nutrition panel on the side of your cereal box this morning descends in a straight line from that chart. Then Choate turned around and looked at the television set, where, by his own estimate, a child was absorbing as many as 22,000 commercials a year. He was not the only one staring at the screen. In a living room in Massachusetts, 4 mothers had been watching it for 2 years already. In 1968, 4 mothers in Newton, Massachusetts, founded a group called Action for Children's Television. One of them was Peggy Charon, a woman alarmed by what she called wall-to-wall monster cartoons and the sugar ads stitched between them. By July of 1971, more than 80,000 letters supporting the group's proposals had reached federal regulators. 80,000 letters from a movement that started, as the story is always told, with 4 women and a coffee table. Robert Choate was in the fight too, with a council on children's media of his own. He kept filing petitions through the decade and then faded from it. In 1977, the group and its allies petitioned the Federal Trade Commission, and in February 1978, the commission's staff answered with a proposal the industry would never forgive: ban all television advertising aimed at children too young to understand that a commercial is trying to sell them something. Ban ads for the most cavity-causing sugared products aimed at children under 12. The chairman was Michael Perchuk, a longtime Senate Commerce Committee counsel appointed by President Carter, and he had already said out loud that advertising to small children was inherently unfair. Because a 6-year-old cannot detect a sales pitch aimed at a 6-year-old. The backlash began on March 1, 1978, and it began in a liberal newspaper. The Washington Post ran an editorial titled "The FTC as National Nanny," and it said the plan was designed to protect children from the weakness of their parents. Those words ran on the editorial page of the Post, in print, under the paper's own name. Perchuk later called it the turning point, and the industry made sure it was. In April 1978, Kellogg sued the commission. Advertising trade groups sued Perchuk personally, and that November, a federal judge threw him off his own proceeding. An appeals court later put him back. He stepped aside anyway. The cereal, candy, sugar, broadcasting and advertising interests reportedly raised $16 million to fight the rule, about 1/4 of the FTC's entire annual budget, aimed at a single rulemaking. The hearings reportedly swelled to 200 witnesses and 60,000 pages. Then Congress stopped paying. On May 1, 1980, the Federal Trade Commission became the first and only federal agency in American history shut down by Congress over a policy dispute. Its lawyers photographed packing active case files into boxes. 4 weeks later, a new law stripped the agency of the power to write children's advertising rules on grounds of unfairness. Carter signed it, saying he did so because the very existence of the agency was at stake. In its final report, the staff's own arithmetic found that under one proposed audience test, the ban would have touched exactly one network program, Captain Kangaroo. On September 30, 1981, hours before Reagan's new chairman was sworn in, the commissioners killed the rule themselves, and one of the people who fought for the rule later called the final report a message in a bottle to future advocates. The Post, to its credit, had already conceded in a 1979 follow-up that there is need for a national nanny after all, though it aimed the line at the squabbling adults in the hearing room, not at the children. Almost no one remembers that part. But the unfairness ban is still in the FTC Act today, and no federal rule has touched food advertising to children since. The referee was gone, and the biggest lie of all was already older than any of them. It had been in print since 1917. In August 1917, in the pages of a magazine called Good Health, published by Dr. John Harvey Kellogg out of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, a dietitian named Lena Cooper, trained by the doctor himself, wrote that breakfast is in many ways the most important meal of the day. That is the origin. The most repeated nutrition claim on Earth was not handed down from science. It was published in the cereal empire's own house magazine by the cereal king's own dietitian. Good Housekeeping had printed a similar sentiment in 1889, but it was marketing that made the sentence immortal. In 1944, Post hammered wartime radio with a grape nuts campaign built on it. Eat a good breakfast, do a better job. And the sentence had a sibling. In the 1920s, Edward Bernays, the founding father of modern public relations, engineered the famous Doctors Recommend a Hearty Breakfast campaign on behalf of bacon. The most important meal of the day was never a discovery. It was a group project. Then the myth grew armor, fortification. The same spray that gained Choate's chart had begun decades earlier. In 1938, by most accounts, Kellogg's Pep became the first fortified cereal, sprayed with vitamins B and D. In May 1941, with war coming, 900 delegates packed the Mayflower Hotel in Washington for the National Nutrition Conference for Defense, and the enrichment standard born that year wiped out pellagra and beriberi as endemic American diseases. That part was a genuine public health triumph, but the industry learned the lesson sideways, because a sprayed-on vitamin is a printable claim. By 1961, General Mills was selling Total on fortification alone, stacking bowls of rival cereals in its ads to match one bowl of its own. And then the incantation, part of a complete breakfast. According to the story, regulators forced cereal makers to say it. No record of any such rule exists. It appears to have grown out of the broadcaster's own code for children's advertising and out of companies hedging against deception charges before anyone filed them. A legal shield, read in a cheerful announcer's voice over a bowl of sugar, flanked by milk, juice, toast, and an egg nobody was eating. The shield worked. In 2011, Yale researchers showed parents nutritionally poor children's cereals carrying technically accurate claims, and most parents concluded the products were healthy. The study's lead author, Jennifer Harris, called the tactic a highly effective and low-risk marketing strategy for food companies. But the spell was wearing off. Between 2000 and the mid-2010s, American cereal sales fell by almost 30%, from $13.9 billion toward $10. Measured in actual cereal, the country poured 2.1 million metric tons into bowls in 2008 and 1.6 million by 2023, one bowl in 4 gone. In 2015, the research firm Mintel asked millennials about breakfast, and almost 40% gave an answer their grandparents would not have believed. Cereal was inconvenient because someone had to wash the bowl. Lena Cooper's sentence still sells breakfast today, on boxes, in headlines, in your own head. Its congregation is leaving, and the story bent back toward where it began. Zurich, Switzerland. Around the year 1900, a physician named Maximilian Bircher-Benner, whose own medical association dismissed his ideas as unscientific, began feeding his patients 1 tablespoon of oats soaked for 12 hours, and a whole grated apple, peel, and core included. He called it the apple diet dish. He served it at supper, not at breakfast. His Zurichberg Sanatorium hosted Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse, and Hesse reportedly called the regime a hygienic penitentiary. The world simplified the name to muesli. It sits on hotel buffets on every continent. The cure outlived the doctrine. It usually does. In 1964, a lapsed Seventh-day Adventist named Leighton Gentry sold the rights to his oat granola recipe for $3,000, roughly half of what an American family lived on in a year. Time magazine called him Johnny Granola Seed. 3 years later, he bought half the rights back for $1,500 and sold them again. He is the only man in this story who sold the same breakfast twice. In 1969, granola was handed through the crowd at Woodstock, the wholesome rebuke to everything Battle Creek had become. The rebuke lasted 3 years. By 1972, Quaker, Pet Milk, General Mills, and Kellogg's itself were selling granola back to the counterculture. And the word was never rebel property. Granola was John Harvey Kellogg's 1880s rename, one vowel swapped, of James Caleb Jackson's Granular, the wheat rocks from the Dansville hillside, dated by the legend to 1863. Jackson's side sued, or at least reached for lawyers, and Kellogg's entire defense was to change the U to an O and keep selling. The promised fight over the name, one letter at a time. The revolution was a rerun of Sanitarium health food, a century old, sold twice. On October 2nd, 2023, the Kellogg Company, 117 years old, cut itself in two. The snacks and the international business became a company called Kellanova. The North American cereal stayed in Battle Creek under the name W.K. Kellogg. Within 2 years, both halves were swallowed. Mars bought Kellanova for roughly $36 billion. Ferrero bought W.K. Kellogg for $3.1 billion. The snack half sold for 11 times the price of the cereal half, which means the company founded on cornflakes was worth, at the end, mostly its Pringles. And so the flake invented to purify the American body now belongs to the family that makes Nutella. No one involved appears to have noticed. In Battle Creek, the arithmetic is quieter. Kellogg employed about 2,000 people the day of the split. Roughly 1,450 remain. Ferrero says it will make the town its North American cereal headquarters, and the plant is still running. But this is the town that once held 40-odd cereal companies at once, where, the story goes, a depot billboard promised strangers they could better themselves in Battle Creek. It still calls itself Cereal City. It is now deciding, out loud, what that name means when the empire that wrote it is gone. The last piece of Battle Creek arithmetic is not about money. Near the end of his life, John Harvey wrote his brother a letter, 7 pages by one account, asking to make amends for every wrong he had done him. The story Battle Creek tells is that Will never saw it in time. A secretary decided the apology demeaned the great doctor and filed it away. By most accounts, it reached Will, nearly blind, years after the doctor died in 1943, read aloud to him. Will died in 1951. They are buried in Oak Hill Cemetery, their family plots only yards apart. The Flakes began as a sermon. They became an industry, then an inheritance, then a line on someone else's balance sheet. The sermon is finished. The bowl is still on the table. A minister who believed white bread was a sin, a prophetess who saw the road to heaven passing through a bowl of Graham mush, a doctor who declared war on flavor, on stimulation, on desire itself, and whose war produced, more or less by accident, the most successful breakfast on earth, a younger brother who added sugar and built an empire on it, and around them the century assembled its cast. A bankrupt patient, wheeled in according to legend, who taught the modern world what advertising is, a town that went briefly insane, a tiger that sold sugar to 3 generations of children, a citizen with a chart who read an entire industry, its own numbers, in a hearing room of the United States Senate. And at the end of it all, a bowl of granola, carrying a name coined, the story goes, in the 1860s, sold back to us as the healthy alternative. Breakfast cereal was born as a rebellion against the American diet, became the American diet, and is now being rebelled against in turn. The health food became the junk food, and the junk food became the nostalgia food. The empire it built has been split in half and sold, one piece to a candy company and the other to a chocolate family from Italy. But the proverb it made immortal, that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, has outlived the empire itself. And tomorrow morning, all over the world, millions of people will pour flakes into a bowl, add milk, and eat, without once thinking about religious visions, or Senate hearings, or a doctor who believed flavor was a moral emergency. But now, you know the real story. The strangest food in your kitchen has been hiding in plain sight, in the brightest box on the shelf, all along. If you enjoyed this journey through the history of breakfast cereal, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of the story surprised you the most, and make sure to like this video so more people can find it. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.